Welcome to another interview with Dr. Elizabeth Sheff and the Sexual Health Alliance. Today we are interviewing Daniel Copulsky, who is a graduate student in a doctoral program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and has done some really fascinating research on asexuality and consensual non-monogamy. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for coming.
Hi, thank you for having me.
What program are you in at UCSC?
So I'm in the social psychology program at Santa Cruz, in a lab that really focuses on sexuality and relationships. So most of my research is about sexual identity terms and labels, how people define their identities, how they make sense of their identities, and how people think about sexual orientation.
And what kind of research have you done on asexuality and polyamory?
So I've done a bit of work now looking at the overlap between these two communities. I got interested in this because I was actually blogging about polyamory, writing mostly from my own experiences in polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships. And I was actually surprised when I saw that some of my audience was asexual folks. I think like other people might have this reaction. The first thought is we sort of start thinking about polyamory and non-monogamy in terms of having sex with multiple partners. So when we hear people who we think aren't having sex or interested in it, it seems sort of confusing. So I think that the sort of starting point there is that there's a couple big reasons that asexual folks might be interested in polyamory. One of them is that sometimes, like some other folks in poly and non-monogamous relationships, it might be a way to address like some different interests in the relationships. So if an asexual person is dating a person who does want to have sex, non-monogamy can be a way to sort of allow them to have those needs met outside the relationship. And that's kind of similar to something we sometimes see with some like kinky non-monogamous folks where like their kink or BDSM interests aren't quite the same. So they go, oh, if we can do this outside of our couple, we can all get those needs met. But I think what's really important is that's definitely not the only reason asexual folks might be interested in polyamory. The other thing to consider is just that polyamory can mean just multiple romantic or intimate relationships. And certainly there are asexual folks who for all the same reasons as other polyamorous folks, just want to have multiple romantic or intimate relationships.
Without necessarily the sex.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, as a slight digression, could you maybe talk about the difference between asexual and gray sexual? And is sapiosexual in that same category?
Sure. So the simple definition for asexuality, and it's important to say it's a diverse community and people will define these words in lots of different ways, is someone who does not experience sexual attraction. Um, and even in that, it can be worth saying that some asexuals, for a variety of reasons, do occasionally have sex, that there might be a difference between the attraction component and the behavior component, or even the attraction component and like the ability to enjoy the activity itself. Um, and then sort of more broadly, there's an asexual community, sometimes called the ace spectrum, that includes even more diversity in how people feel about sexual attraction. So a couple common identities are gray asexual, which is sort of anyone who falls somewhere on that spectrum between asexual and non-asexual. And then demisexual, which is folks who experience sexual attraction only after forming an emotional connection or bond with someone else. So an identity like sapiosexual might be used by some of those folks, although I've also heard that one sort of used outside of any sort of asexual
Right,
context.
right. Cool. And so how did you do your research on asexuality and polyamory? Like, how'd you collect the data?
Sure. So I've done a couple pieces now. I had an article a few years ago in the Journal of Positive Sexuality, and that one really grew out of the blogging work I was doing. So that was sort of some informal interviews I did with people I was interacting with through some social media pages. Um, I had a sort of follow-up to that was a chapter in an anthology called Expanding the Rainbow that took a more theoretical, abstract perspective, sort of describing some of these issues around these topics. And then some of the more recent work I've been doing has been based on data from the Asexual Community Survey. So this is a project that's been going on a number of years, and that I should make really clear, I haven't been involved in designing that survey or collecting that data. That research team has just very generously been willing to share their data with other researchers. So that's a really amazing data set. They get a huge amount of community buy-in every year for this survey. So it's a survey that takes like about a half hour to complete, and the past couple of years they've had over 10,000 people complete that survey. So that's almost as if someone was taking that survey continuously for the whole year, and sort of minutes spent on it. And it's also, there's no budget or like rewards for participating in that. So it's just about the asexual community really wanting better data about who they are and what their experiences are.
So you're helping them out basically by analyzing some of that data.
Yes, so the sort of
Helping
interesting
you out.
balance with,
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely mutually beneficial.
Right.
Maybe sort of what I think is a kind of weird balance with this survey is they have this huge amount of community buy-in, but it's also clearly run by a group of volunteers who don't have a ton of time to devote to going through all the data they collect. So they've released some sort of summary data looking at pieces of it, but it's such a rich data set. There's a lot more to dig into and look at in there.
Well, yay you. Collaborating with them like that. That's fantastic. I know you gave us a few of your findings in terms of reasons for for an asexual person wanting to be polyamorous. Do you have any other little tidbits of your findings we might find interesting?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things is just that polyamory seems to be particularly popular in the asexual community. Um, a lot of these numbers are sort of hard to get at. We don't have like a representative survey of the United States for polyamory in general. So a lot of estimates say that maybe about 5% of the United States would consider themselves polyamorous. Within this asexual data set, it seems to be about twice as high as that. So about 10% of folks saying that they identify as polyamorous. And then an even larger number, about 25%, saying that they're like unsure of a polyamorous identity. So maybe some kind of openness to that. So that really suggests it's a lot of people in
Significant overlap. Very interesting. Any other little tidbits you have for us?
Yeah, so yeah, digging into the data set, just trying to make sense of it, there's a couple of things worth saying. One is that, if you look at it by like generational cohort, it's more Gen Xers and millennials who are identifying as polyamorous, not just the Zoomers. This isn't just a generational thing. Although it might be that the folks who are participating in these online communities of asexuality and polyamory, maybe it's just those are the kind of folks who would have more of these identities and would be drawn to more communities. It's also, I know we sort of have this in data from polyamory in general too, that there's higher rates of queer and bisexual and pansexual identities among polyamorous folks. That holds true for polyamorous asexuals as well, which to me at least suggests that there's something about people wanting to have partners of different genders that has some relationship for some people with wanting to be in multiple relationships. And then the other thing I found really interesting in this data is that there was about a third of the folks who say they're polyamorous and asexual also say they're aromantic, which are folks who don't experience romantic attraction. So this sort of says there are people saying they don't experience sexual or romantic attraction, but are still drawn to having multiple intimate relationships of some kind, which I think is really interesting and brings in something sort of interesting to think about what polyamory can look like.
Right.
And then I think sort of like a big takeaway for me from all of this is that both of these identities or sort of challenge some of like the normative assumptions about relationships, what's been called like the charm circle relationships. So polyamory and non-monogamy challenges this assumption of monogamy, and then asexuality challenges this assumption that everyone has sex in their relationship. So I think there's maybe something to that. If you start challenging one of these components of a relationship, maybe it's a little bit easier to start challenging some other assumptions and to be able to kind of define your whole relationship on your own terms with what you really want to get out of it.
I definitely found that when I was examining the intersection of polyamory and BDSM.
For
Exactly.
sure.
You just found with polyamory and asexuality. That is interesting. And LGBT as well. Once you've already
Mhm.
in sex relationship, then you're breaking the rules. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I wonder if you have any last little tidbit of advice for counselors and therapists who would like to serve polyamorous and other CNM clients effectively.
Sure. I think my big thing is to just not make assumptions about your clients, and not, even if they say an identity label that you feel like you're familiar with, to not assume you know exactly what that means for them. So there are some asexual folks who might have sex for some reason or another, and there are asexual folks who are interested in non-monogamy. And likewise, there are non-monogamous folks who might not be having sex or might not be having sex with all their partners. Um, so to just, when you hear those terms, you know, ask more questions, ask what it means for the client. Don't assume it looks exactly the same for everyone. Yeah, the other sort of piece I think is sometimes helpful for thinking about some of this stuff is that some folks, both asexual and non-asexual, really think of polyamory and non-monogamy as this sort of orientation or this like innate thing where we're naturally inclined to, that really feels natural for us. And I think it's important that for some asexuals that holds true, but then also that across the board for some poly and non-monogamous folks, it's more of this conscious choice. It's about the life situation we're in right now, you know, like I'm in grad school across the country from my partner, so like maybe it makes sense right now to be non-monogamous, or you know, because I really love someone who has these interests I can't meet, we should be polyamorous. So I think it can be a choice too, and I think it's really important to remember that for any individual person, it might be anywhere on that spectrum between that sort of orientation model and that choice approach.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your interesting ideas. I look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Great, thank you so much for having me.